as I mentioned, we have 4 great presentations, and then we'll open it up for a great discussion. And Jeremy, has a few questions for you all. And so, with having said that, I think I've wasted enough of everyone's time here trying to get going. So why don't we just turn it over to Tom to start the discussion here about using data from a statewide count program. And so I'm going to send it over to Tom.
Good afternoon, everyone. So, Carl, can you see my screen?
Yep, looks good.
Great, we're in business. So let's start at the state level and work our way down. So today, Spencer, my colleague, and I are going to be talking about the state programs for bicycling and pedestrian counting. A little bit on the background, what are the purposes in the uses. A little bit on the degrees of collaboration and coordination, which is of importance to MPO, some examples, and then finally some of the findings of based on the work with that we've had working with 3 DOTs and doing a national guide for bicycle and pedestrian counting. So as most of you know, state DOTs have a very robust program to count motorized traffic, but very limited counting of bicycles and pedestrians over the years. Yes, they often do manual counts and have been for decades of pedestrians at intersections, usually for signal operations. That has changed over the last couple of decades. Over the last 2 or 3 decades, there's been a push to count bicyclists and pedestrians at the state level, local level, and 10 to 15 years ago, it got a big push when the automated counting devices became more affordable and more effective in counting bicyclists and pedestrians. So basically, had technology that was driving the practicality, but rarely were DOTs looking and counting bicyclists and pedestrians in a systematic way. And having worked with Wisconsin DOT during that time frame, the example is that we bought 5 or 6 of the automated counters, and we used them, but we used them in a very haphazard fashion, loaning them out, often doing counts for particular projects. So it was useful, but not systematic. I'll turn it over to Spencer.
Thanks, Tom. We try to think of statewide programs in terms of 3 kind of primary objectives. These aren't mutually exclusive. You could have a program that addresses all 3 at the same time, but they kind of require different areas of emphasis and different strategies to address each need. And the first is focusing on state-owned facilities. So this would be trying to answer the question, how many bicyclists do we have per day on State Highway 100? This is focused on, just the state-owned facilities exclusively and usage on those facilities. So it would be focused on trails and highways. The second is more of a local training and outreach. So this could be providing support to local communities that want to do that want to do their own counts. Could even involve things like equipment loans. Maybe the state has counters that they loan out to local communities, facilitating information sharing, those kinds of efforts. And then the third is a more comprehensive look. This is kind of asking the question, what is the state of bicycling or walking across the entire state? So this would be a more involved effort. There could be some element of centralized data collection. It would probably involve coordinating with local municipalities to get count data from within the municipalities. May even involve things like surveys or other methods for getting a more holistic view of bicycle and pedestrian travel across the state. And we'll go back to Tom.
So some of those uses at the state level, overall usage, and then of course the trend determination after a few years. States will and hopefully will collect data to measure exposure along corridors, so those are the safety uses, and to do before and after counts on particular projects, and then projection of usage to help base their funding decisions. Some of the ranges of use and examples of DOT activities, we mentioned already loaners and the one-off counts. Some of the DOTs will actually set up their counters to count bicyclists and pedestrians at permanent and continuous as permanent and continuous count locations. And it's probably more often that you'll find states doing counts on a state trail system than on a state highway system. DelDOT recently took a different approach before deciding, and that's Delaware DOT, before deciding to buy equipment and start their count program. They decided to do an approach, and they did a statewide approach to do a statewide count set of activities. Colorado DOT was an early adopter of the automated count equipment. Last year they decided to take a step back after doing 7 or 8 years worth of counts and said, well, maybe we can do a better job and a more systematic approach. So that's what they're up to right now. Some of the important findings in the future of counting at the statewide level. One thing that we learned working with Delaware DOT is that a pilot program is very helpful. A 1 or 2 year pilot program was considered to be very beneficial for the state of Delaware. If you're going through all the effort of collecting data, you should share that data, but you need to consider how you're going to share that data and to whom you're going to share that data with. The other edge of that two-edged sword is don't underestimate the amount of time it takes to clean and make that data available. Counting bicyclists and pedestrians along the street is a real commitment. You need one counter to collect bicycle information only along a trail, but you need 4 counters to count bicyclists and pedestrians along the street. And of course, we learned that with our work at the national level and with working with Delaware DOT. Integration with a traffic monitoring program. All state DOTs have a traffic monitoring program. It's best to integrate the counting of bicyclists and pedestrians into that overall traffic monitoring program. I think the next wave, the future for counting is that we'll do more automated counting, but that automated counting along with some manual counting can be combined with some form of self-reporting, electronic self-reporting through Strava or through a bike share program, and fill in the gaps that way. And that's the work that we did in Seattle. That is not Seattle. The image that you're seeing is Minneapolis, but that's kind of the standard that we're looking at, is being able to open up a file and be able to get data for your collectors and your arterials and your paths and your bikeway system, much like we do for roadways. And that map reflects just that, the bicycle ADT within the city of Minneapolis. So I'll turn it back over. We're going to Daniel now.
Yes, Thomas, thank you. If you can pass me the presentation power.
Just change it over.
Great, thank you. So can anyone confirm what you're seeing on the screen, please?
Yeah, Daniel, we see your desktop right now.
Okay, let me move my
Yeah, there we
PowerPoint
go.
there. Thank you. Well, I'm going to go ahead and do it this way because for some reason I'm projecting the wrong screen. But I hope it's visible right now. Is that fairly visible?
It is.
Yes, so well, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about opportunities to partner with universities. Now you have this wonderful collection of data, And the question is, how can you leverage some of the resources that you have available to exploit what the data provides? And many of the MPOs, many of your locations have universities that are local with departments of civil engineering or city planning departments or statistics departments even. And what I wanted to do was highlight, well, some of the possibilities that exist here for exploiting this type of data. First, identifying project possibilities that could come from many multiple sources. It could be you, the MPO, thinking perhaps about calibration or simply monitoring or analyzing a specific trend or a closure that happened, something led by you. Or it could be the researcher or the student that could be leading some data mining. There's a panoply of opportunities, as you were hearing from Thomas, for data sharing with entities outside of the MPO. And I think it's fair to say that maybe some places would want to keep that data close and not share it very much. And I would encourage you to think about sharing it. Not only sharing it some, like I'm going to argue here with universities, but really share it with all. I think the experience that we've had with Arlington County has been very successful, Arlington County, Virginia, that as the data got shared more broadly, hackers and others were very interested in playing with the data and finding interesting trends and information that actually made for better planning in the future. I've been doing this for the last 5 years, this sort of connecting with the municipality and the MPO with varying degrees of success. And I can highlight here 3 major characteristics that make this data sharing successful. The first one is to have a very narrow question. For example, what I suggest here, let's make sure that we calibrate or validate the counters at X locations. The second one is that you are swimming in data. It's all very enticing to kind of put it all up there and share it. But most likely a subset of the data is what most people would want to use, driven again by a question, perhaps a season, perhaps something that happened. And unless it's necessary, I would encourage you not to share those very, very, very large data sets to everyone, because it becomes actually cumbersome to even manage the data. A few months, maybe 6 months would be fine. And again, Thomas highlighted the importance of annotation or metadata. That takes a significant amount of time, but makes the data much, much more usable for others. Here's one example of what we did with Arlington County, and it had to do with quality analysis and quality control. They had this great data, very detailed. It just hadn't been unpacked. And so they sent us the data. We were able, with the students for a student project, were able to figure out that there were some problems with some of the information we got originally. The locality was thinking that there was an issue with the counter, but that red counter that you see there, that kind of dropped abruptly between 5 and 6 p.m. For a given day. It turns out that what happened is that there was an incident on this bridge, on this axis, and the whole bridge was closed for those 2 hours. And so some data sleuthing, and this was at a distance, we're several hundred miles away from Arlington County, Virginia, we were able to identify what happened there and explain some of the issues and not throw away the data that was being questioned. Another example, and these were all student-initiated possibilities and projects, had to do with thinking about nearby amenities as predictors of counts. And this is kind of a first and rudimentary approach to something that you'll hear in more detail in a couple of presentations by our colleagues. In this case, a student was very interested in looking at walk score and how it associates with the counts. So here's kind of a heat map of walk score in Arlington County, Virginia. Those blue lines are the separate trails. And you see on the left-hand side the pedestrian count locations with the highest walk score circled in blue, and the lowest in red, and the opposite for the bicycle locations. And so the student was able to analyze what was happening and notice that some of the bicycle locations actually have some parallel facilities that were better used And in some cases, the bicycle lanes, as you see in this picture, the on-road facilities, were being blocked by many delivery vehicles. Again, this is something that happened at a distance, but was able to be identified even from just the pictures that over one day the Google Street View vehicle was able to take. So just imagine how more common this might be. And I close with the idea that we've also been able to do some local partnerships for manual counting and have been able to conduct 12-hour manual counts in 18 locations. And that was instrumental in helping, in this case, the town of Carrboro, in being able to install 2 permanent counters in the places where they thought they would be most helpful. So again, another possibility of a partnership between the university and our locality, but in this case, thinking about manual counting and how it relates to the permanent counters that you all have been installing. So with that, let me turn it over. Please, who's next? Robert, I think?
Yes, thanks, Daniel. All right, so I've got show my screen. Can everybody see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, great. So I'm Bob Schneider, and I am going to give an example of a university and agency partnership that looks at a very specific question. What characteristics make a roadway intersection more or less likely to have pedestrian crashes? And this was done as a partnership between Alameda County, California, where Oakland is, and the UC Berkeley Safe Trek back when I was there in 2008, 2009. The question is fairly straightforward and simple, and I'm not going to get into all the technical aspects of how to analyze it, but we really want to know how can we design an intersection that is going to have fewer crashes for pedestrians over time. One of the essential components, there are many different factors that we could consider as influencing the potential risk at an intersection, the design in terms of number of lanes, turning radius, surrounding land uses, the socioeconomic characteristics of the neighborhood, but one really important factor to consider is exposure, and that's, in the way we define it, the total number of pedestrian crossings at the intersection given in a given time period. If you don't account for exposure with your count data, then you're not going to be able to get or understand the relationship between the other characteristics and crash risk correctly. So exposure was central to what we were doing. For our study, we looked at 81 different intersections in Alameda County, shown as the black dots here. We used manual counters, volunteers, to count at a variety of locations for 2-hour periods on a weekday and a Saturday at each of those 81 locations. But we also wanted to understand the long-term pedestrian volume patterns. And so we had the automated counters at 13 of these intersections shown in red, so that we were able to use the automated counter data to expand our 2-hour manual counts. So this is the pattern that we used, which was an average across those 13 locations to start with. And if we had a count period from Tuesday from 4 to 6 p.m., for example, we knew that that represented about 1.1% of the week. We could expand that out to the week, and then eventually out to the year and out to 10 years, which is what we had crash data to compare to. It's important to get as good of an estimate of the pedestrian volume as possible, since that's a critical factor in this analysis. And to do that, we made some other adjustments to the data that included looking at the surrounding land uses and weather conditions. So if somebody was taking counts during a time that it was cloudy, for example, we knew that that time period would have about an 11% lower count of pedestrians crossing the intersection. And so we needed to adjust that count to match up with our average pattern that we were using for expansion. There's more details behind that, but the bottom line is we want to use these counts and as much information as we can get from the automated counters and the long-term patterns to create our estimate of the long-term pedestrian volume. So we were able to come up with our best guess at a 10-year pedestrian volume estimate, which is shown in the red column there, and then divided the number of crashes by that estimate to get the pedestrian crash rate per 10 million crossings, and we could see which intersections had the highest risk, and they ranged from 0.7 to 98 pedestrian crashes per 10 million crossings. This information is useful, and it's related to the next step that we did, which was trying to identify those specific factors that were associated with the number of pedestrian crashes. The model that's shown here in this slide accounts for pedestrian exposure, which is the top variable shown, as well as a number of other characteristics that have a significant association with the number of crashes that were reported at the intersection. For those of you who have heard about safety performance functions, this is an example of that type of equation. And from that, we can take a look at if we hold all other variables constant, what will changing one variable at the intersection do to the expected number of pedestrian crashes? Well, pedestrian crossings, the exposure is obviously important. So if we double the number of pedestrian crossings, so increase it by 100%, we would actually see more pedestrian crashes. Of course, it's important to note that it's not 100% more pedestrian crashes, it's only 49% more. So that's an evidence of safety in numbers. The risk per pedestrian actually goes down. The same was not seen when we saw an increase in motor vehicle volume. So controlling for pedestrian crossing volume, we then could say, here's the expected effect of adding right turn only lanes or adding a median. So adding a right turn only lane would increase the number of expected crashes by 53%. Medians would decrease expected crashes by 75%. This is similar to what some of the other literature finds. And we looked at several other characteristics as well. Importantly, from this type of analysis, because we accounted for exposure, we can make estimates of what will happen under different conditions. This graph just shows what the predictions from that safety performance function would be. As you go to the right on the graph, that's representing an increase in pedestrian volume. So we do see an increased expected number of crashes, though it increases at a decreasing rate. And we can also see that if we are holding every other variable constant, what happens if we add medians to the intersection. You see the line goes from the top one to the middle one and then the bottom one. So actually it's the top one versus the bottom one, either no medians or medians. So you can see the predicted effects of that. Now, this research was based on a small number of intersection locations, and it was one of the first studies where we really tried to get exposure data. So we're just trying to show that this is something that you can do in your own jurisdiction and add on to the other knowledge that other agencies and organizations have as they do more research on this, and we can get even better estimates of how intersection design relates to crash risk in the future. So after that example, I want to pass it along to Frank to hear a little bit more about demand estimation.
Thanks, Bob. Let's see. Can everybody see my screen now? See some slides?
Yes.
Yep. Well, a little wide.
A little wide.
I'm not sure if we can see. I'm not sure if we can see your whole screen right now.
Oh.
Yeah, it looked like it was only showing a portion of it.
Better?
Yes, that's it.
Cool. Okay, so I'm going to be talking here a little bit more about demand estimation, and specifically what I mean by that is this problem where we've gone out and we've collected a bunch of counts. This is an example of PM peak bicycle volumes in San Francisco, and this is some great information, but it's still incomplete, and specifically it's incomplete spatially. We know what's going on at these particular locations, but we don't necessarily know what's going on at other locations on the network. And this is an important thing to have. In one example why it's important is with the safety performance functions that Bob was talking about. If we want to go and apply that to our network, one of the critical inputs is that exposure data on every link. So without a decent estimate of what exposure is on all links of the network, we can't go and use that nice model. There are a few different techniques for doing this type of estimation. Here I'm going to focus on one, though, that's known as direct demand modeling. So direct demand modeling is an approach where, given that we have volumes observed on a link or on an intersection on our network, we take that count and regress it on a number of characteristics that we think could plausibly be affecting demand at a given location. And so this is typically some combination of surrounding land uses at varying buffers, as suggested in this picture, the transportation network characteristics at that location, so whether or not there's a bike lane right there, for instance, might affect how many bike trips we expect to pass that location, and any other demographic information, just anything that we could conceive as affecting demand. Big advantage of this technique is that it's relatively easy to implement as compared with more sophisticated demand models. Basically requires knowing how to do ordinary least squares regression and work with GIS data at a basic level. You can, of course, get more sophisticated with it, but just to get a crude estimate, this will work. One disadvantage is it doesn't necessarily have a strong behavioral basis. The land uses immediately surrounding a location might not really be what's driving demand there, but for a first order approximation, it's pretty good. Here's one example from San Francisco of a pedestrian volume model that Bob and a few others worked on, relating pedestrian volumes at intersection crossings to some of the various factors I suggested previously, and finding some significant effects with the total number of households within a quarter mile and employment, whether the intersection is in what's termed here a high activity zone, so central business district type of area, slopes nearby, so if there's higher slopes on nearby approaches, we might expect fewer people to be walking in that location, as well as proximity to university campuses. We know these are big trip attractors, specifically for walking trips, so we can again expect that there would be some effect there. I also want to point everybody, I can't recall if we've talked about this previously in this webinar series or not, but I want to point everybody to the Federal Highway's non-motorized travel analysis toolkit, which is a nice web tool for taking previously developed models, such as the one that I pointed to from San Francisco, as well as if you develop your own, taking it and applying it to your network to create volume estimates. So if you just have your counts and your GIS data matching a previously developed model, you can take it to this tool and create your own volume estimates based on the model. Finally, I just want to point everybody to the notion that you can also use these counts that you're collecting with your MPO's larger scale travel demand models. So if you're in a region that has some sort of 4-step or activity-based travel model, pedestrian and bicycle counts can be used in calibration of that model to make it more accurate. And this is not necessarily something that a single person would take on. This is kind of a big undertaking, and I won't get too much into the technical details here, but just want to point to it as another strong use case for having high-quality bike and pedestrian count data, and that if you have some modelers in your agency, that you might want to push on them to incorporate pedestrians and bicycles into their models, because if we don't plan for pedestrians and bicyclists, we probably won't build our networks in ways that are supportive of walking and biking. So that's what I have to say about demand estimation, and now I think we're on some questions. Question time.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thanks everyone for these presentations, and hopefully that gave the participants a little something to think about, as to what you can do with all this data that you are collecting and will continue to collect.
So he's saying it would be useful to have some project ideas or scope outlines for potential MPO university collaboration.
Yes, I'll take the lead on that one. This is Dan Rodriguez. Absolutely, I'll be happy to share with you, perhaps offline or through certainly through HSRC, the documents that we put together that specify the type of activities that we were looking for and how the project evolved with respect to Arlington County. And so that's certainly a start. And what I found is that most of you are, of course, really busy, and there's very little extra time to do these types of things. And so, as you perhaps your request suggests, to the extent that you can have something already available that you can share with a local university to improve the process, all the better.
So we have another question in here. Somebody's asking about a best practice for extrapolating short-term data over longer periods of time.
This is Bob, and I'll pass it along to Frank after I'm done. But one reference to definitely check out is the NCHRP 797 guidebook, because we talked about that a fair amount in that. The one key thing to remember is that the longer period of data that you can do for data collection, so doing 8 hours instead of 2 hours, or 2 or 3 days instead of 1 day, will allow you to make a better estimate of the longer-term pedestrian or bicycle volume. And I know Frank's doing a lot of work with this, so Frank, do you have anything to add on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think we've spoken to this some in one of the previous webinars as well. But the basic commonly accepted technique right now is to extend your short duration count by your estimate of the proportion of the total volume that it makes up based on an automated count. So say you think that 1 day that you counted represents maybe 1/300th of the year, so it's slightly higher than an average day out of the year, then you would just multiply that daily total by 300. That's the basic idea. You can, of course, as with most things, make it more sophisticated as you want.
Okay, so we have another question in the chat pod. The Richmond TPO is working with the state. Oh, I'm sorry, this is a comment. So the Richmond TPO is working with the state, but the state has liability concerns regarding the use of their counters in this effort.
Can whoever wrote that expand a little bit more on the liability concerns?
Yes, I had the same question. What concerns about liability exist in using the existing data?
So she's adding to it saying the use of MPO counters for state efforts.
Right, just to clarify, I think the question is really about the positioning of the counters themselves and the question of what's happening when they're on the roads that are owned by the other agency, not the MPO.
Right. So in terms of getting agreement from the state to allow the MPO to put the counters in the state right of way. That's my understanding of that. And that is an important issue to be talking about upfront in any data collection effort, trying to get those agreements and making sure that everybody who has jurisdiction over where the counters will be placed, whether it's another transportation agency or if it's a utility in terms of utility poles, the earlier you can have the discussions, the better. That may not help in your particular situation right now, and it may require a couple of months of negotiation to sort through that. But yeah, it's an important issue to try to take care of sooner rather than later.
Yeah, and I would add to that, Robert, that the bottom line is that all the parties need to be comfortable with what's being implemented and how it's being implemented. And if, in this case, for example, the state DOT is concerned about a certain proposed implementation, then one needs to try to meet their concerns. Of course, it's their facility, and one needs to kind of encourage them to express what is concerning them about how the proposed implementation is an issue, and address those early on, because otherwise, certainly, it wouldn't be possible to do it in that specific facility if those concerns are not addressed.
One other thought on this that I had is there any way to show the DOT that they will also get benefits from having the data? And that may just be showing the applications that are useful from it.
So one more comment is that Miami-Dade has not worked with Florida DOT, but that's only because they haven't pursued it yet. I don't know if there's anyone else on the phone that wants to share their experience working or not working with the DOT.
And maybe while the questions roll in, that experience of Miami-Dade is not uncommon, because normally you want to become familiar with the technology, you want to become familiar with the deployments, with the data, with what you can do with the data before really approaching the DOT. And so I think what you're doing is absolutely right in terms of becoming familiar with the technology and with its capabilities. And once you have a good sense about what you'd like to do next, that's when the DOT partnership happens.
I think that here in Wisconsin, since I've been in the southeastern Wisconsin region here for 3 years now, I've seen that the regional agency, that's Joe Delamagori and Sewer Pack, the MPO, have been a part of leading this effort here in the state, and that at least at our main DOT headquarters in Madison that they're starting to see the benefits because it's being done here in southeastern Wisconsin first. So it's kind of hard for the overall state to be leading, I think. It's a little bit easier if they can see an example from an MPO first.
All right, and then another comment is that we're still in the process of analyzing our data in Palm Beach MPO. Our state DOT will be collecting more counts soon, but the DOT has purchased Strava data that we'll use to compare with our data.
Yeah, that's a wonderful opportunity that's emerging. Frank, maybe you want to speak to the possibility of complementing counts with other type of technologies like Strava, My Route, My Walk. But that's certainly a hot area right now, complementing these counts with sort of quantified self types of technologies in order to get a better assessment of where people are going, particularly for places where you don't have the counters implemented, post-buy locations maybe, approaching locations, and so you can get a better sense of the map and the distribution of counts.
So I know that we worked with the City of Seattle and overlaying the Strava data over many bicycle and pedestrian counts, so it kind of filled in the voids. But we were also very careful. The Strava data tends to be more recreational in nature, so you have to get some type of idea of who is self-reporting. And in some places it might be working really well, or maybe even some parts of your MPO it might be working really well. In other areas it might not. So you'll want to make sure what that user profile is. If you can get a pretty good idea, and that's part of the problem with the Strava data, is we suspect it's more recreational in nature, but we don't know for sure, or to what extent.
Yeah, that's a good point. It probably, I know some other states have compared, like Oregon has purchased Strava data and compared it to their permanent count stations, and they found that I think generally it was much lower percent of their counts, somewhere around 1% of what the count stations were reporting, but it was pretty consistent. But I'd imagine, Tom, you're right that that was likely, its accuracy was likely reflecting the fact that these were probably in more recreational locations where the users are more likely to be similar in recreational versus perhaps in a more urban location where you have a different user profile. And that kind of, different type, kind of gets back to those different types of count groups and the factor groups, and why you want to sample different types of locations and different user profiles.
And don't get me wrong, I think there's a lot of potential with the self-reporting data, and I think we're just starting to overlay that data on the count data. The count data is obviously most important, so I really want to emphasize that the self-reported data is an overlay on that. It complements the count data and doesn't replace it.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, I think our experience in Seattle was that the use of Strava data or any other self-reported data is only going to be as good as your count program is. So if you only have a few count locations and it's not very robust, the use of external data is not really going to help and may in fact end up making things worse in terms of getting an accurate picture.
I'm right now working in my dissertation, working on taking data from Strava as well as the travel demand model estimates and combining the two of those with counts to try and overcome some of the recreational bias with the Strava data. So that'll be coming out sometime soon for more.
And now if you can overlay that, if you can go back and redo your dissertation if you could add in the bike share data to that.
I do. I have bike share data too.
You do? Great.
Oh, all right.
So you don't have to go back and redo your dissertation.
Well.
That's always good.
And in Montreal, there's some initiatives right now to actually a few Canadian cities. Luis Miranda Moreno has been working on this with his company. I can't recall the name right now, but they've been working on basically pushing crowdsourcing to encourage more people to uptake and report their trips. So less of a passive initiative as Strava is, where they can with that get more of that demographic information, and they're finding very good results with that. So if your agency is very serious about this, that's another option to encourage people to report their trips rather than just passively collect as they're reporting it for their own personal uses.
That's a good point. I think it's a collaboration with EcoCounter now, I believe.
Yeah, that's right.
In fact, I'd love to see more of that idea incorporated into household travel surveys or whatever the next generation of household travel surveys would be. So adding some GPS data collection components and getting people prompted on their phones to provide data.
Yeah, I think that's going to be exploding in the next short while. And we've got things like moves where some people just have a continuous stream of data coming off their phone of what they're doing with mode inference. So as that becomes available, we'll all be out of jobs.
So I guess in the interest of time here, I think we can wrap up. But again, thanks for your participation and for all the presenters for their great information, and just hope everyone has a great afternoon.
Thanks to everyone for their participation.